Okay, so we'd like to get the last session underway, and for that we'd like to invite David Capie to the stage.
David is Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies and Professor of International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington. His research interests focus on the international politics of the Asia-Pacific region and New Zealand's foreign and defence relationships.
Please, could you all welcome David?
Well, kia ora koutou. It's really nice to see. Usually at this sort of stage, you've got to feel like you've got to say something like, thanks so much for those of you who stuck around. But it's amazing. It's wonderful to look out and see such a full room, and I think it speaks to the vibrancy and the richness of the discussions we've had today. Now, I must say that when Melanie asked me to provide some closing, sort of summarising remarks, I was a little hesitant to accept. Mainly because you know that when you have the job of sort of summarising an event like this that has such rich discussions, has so many panels, so many diverse presentations, it's a nearly impossible job to do them all justice. Now, shortly after I'd agreed, I then realised that there were parallel sessions going on at the same time, so it was actually literally an impossible job to be at all of the different sessions. That notwithstanding, I've tried to go back and forth and to listen into as much of the day's discussions as has been possible. I think it's been a terrific day of really rich discussions, and huge credit to the organisers for a really incredible day. All the more incredible that it's taken place under the shadow of COVID with such interesting international speakers. Now, I'm not going to inflict a blow-by-blow recap of the day's discussions on you, but I thought what I would do is just offer a couple of personal takes, 3 or 4 points that really stuck with me, maybe pose a question or two and ask occasionally a little bit of what does this really mean for New Zealand. And I guess the first point that I was struck by listening to the presenters and the panelists today is just the sheer number of incredibly difficult, complex challenges that are confronting New Zealand simultaneously in the middle of 2021. There's climate change, there's this sharp geopolitical competition, there's growing protectionism, disruption to trade, decoupling, the challenge of decoupling, and then of course there's the small matter of a global pandemic. In her remarks, the Prime Minister said, "We have entered an era of formidable environmental, health and geopolitical difficulties." And I think any one of these challenges would have been really difficult for a small, open, trading nation in a big maritime region to wrestle with on its own. But to manage them all simultaneously is a very special kind of challenge. And I went back and I read the Prime Minister's speech that she gave to this very conference in this very building 3.5 years ago, her first big speech as Prime Minister on foreign policy. And I have to say that at the time did not seem like a very cheerful speech. That painted a pretty bleak picture of the world, it seemed then, but there's a real sense listening to people today, a very sharp sense that our strategic environment has changed dramatically for the worse since 2018. And it's not going to get any easier for us soon. And I was struck by some words that Chris Seed, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, said recently when he was speaking to a Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee, where he said, as New Zealand emerges, hopefully, one day, into this post-COVID world, that the world we're going to be dealing with for the next few years will be one that's less open, less prosperous, less secure, and less free. So those are pretty sobering words. So the overall impression I had of the day has been a really sobering one of the sheer number of challenges. Pretty depressing. Now, the second takeaway that I've taken from the day's discussions is that New Zealand has embraced the Indo-Pacific, but wants to do so on its own terms. And I thought it was really important that the Prime Minister signalled that New Zealand is comfortable with the language of the Indo-Pacific, providing a stamp of approval from the highest office in government. This is a concept that's been raised before, that's been debated in bureaucracy and by academics, but today we saw a Prime Minister, I think, speak in the most fulsome and developed way about the importance of this region to New Zealand. And I think she signalled that we're looking to advance an independent foreign policy, working closely with those key partners who have long endorsed and embraced this idea of the Indo-Pacific. But that said, I was struck by the way that the Prime Minister also used the term. Indo-Pacific is usually used as a lens through which to talk about strategic competition with China. And we can think about this language of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. But what the Prime Minister seemed to speak to me and use this as a framework, primarily as a framework for cooperation. Cooperation based on long-standing New Zealand principles, and cooperation that she turned quickly to talk about the need to respond collectively to the challenge of COVID, beginning with her conversation with APEC leaders on Friday. And that wasn't just cooperation with our traditional friends, with like-minded nations, although that is very important and becoming more important. Nor was it the language of a world divided between democracies and autocracies, as we've heard from some recently. New Zealand, as she said, might regret the quote-unquote uneven political developments we've seen in Southeast Asia and condemn the coup in Myanmar, but engaging with democracies only in this part of the world in the Indo-Pacific leaves you with a pretty short list of friends. And of that list of principles that she spoke to that are so important to New Zealand when it thinks about the Indo-Pacific, I was really struck by this paragraph, by this phrase in her speech. And she said, of those principles, the principles of openness and inclusivity are especially key for New Zealand. Often language and geographic frames are used as a subset or a tool to exclude some nations from dialogue. Our success will depend on working with the widest possible set of partners. Now, as well as that commitment to inclusivity, I was struck by the way that the Prime Minister immediately and intuitively answered the question, where do you see our place in the world? And she answered by saying, the Pacific. And I thought that gelled nicely because that seemed to me to be a place where the Pacific is a place where where our partners want us to do more and where we ourselves want to do more. And that gelled nicely with, I think, some of the comments that Kurt Campbell made in his remarks. Now, he gave his usual very strong, persuasive exposition about the rules-based order as a kind of operating system that has underpinned the enormous economic and social success across the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region over many decades, including to China. And New Zealand, of course, has been a huge winner over the last 40 years in a region that has integrated and prospered under US leadership. But we know that, like it or not, the US role in the region is changing. And I thought it was really instructive and interesting that he said the most important part of our strategy is to get things at home right first. That domestic focus is key. But I think, so perhaps not so surprised to hear that, but I think a few more people might have been surprised to hear him just to say that the US isn't a hegemon, but that it's a convening actor. And that caught me somewhat by surprise. Despite the valiant efforts of many of you to try and get questions about a free trade agreement up the Slido banner, we had to take, despite the hints at some possibilities of movement on digital trade, we had to be satisfied with this injunction of please be patient. I thought it was really interesting that when he was asked about what the US expects from New Zealand in the defence and security space, that he immediately turned to the Pacific. He talked about fisheries patrols. He talked about working with partners in the Pacific. He talked about peacekeeping. And it seems to me that that's an agenda where there's plenty of things for New Zealand and like-minded partners to do together. And he was too discreet, I think, probably, to call for an increase in defence spending, despite the valiant efforts of some to put that to him. Very discreet and diplomatic. But I think we should perhaps confront this question and think about what we're seeing in the Pacific. We know that New Zealand has the fourth largest exclusive economic zone in the world. We know that in places like the South China Sea, but not just the South China Sea, that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that's vitally important to New Zealand's interests, as the Prime Minister said, is under challenge. And if we're going to talk about these kind of challenges, I think it's incumbent on us to start saying, what are we going to do about them? The New Zealand Maritime Security Strategy that Centre for Strategic Studies launched just a few weeks ago talks about the need for the New Zealand Defence Force to be deterring adversaries in our maritime domain. How are we going to do this? Who are we going to do this with? We know that grey zone challenges below the level of overt conflict are real, that they may come to the Pacific or the Southern Oceans. And if New Zealand wants to be able to respond to these in a way that's consistent with an independent foreign policy, then I think we need to start having a conversation about all the tools we need to do so, including defence. Now, another key challenge that I think permeated almost every panel that I went to was, of course, COVID, no surprises. And there were just fascinating discussions and panels that addressed its very different dimensions. The human security dimension, the health crisis, the enormous cost it's caused in terms of a loss of life, the way it has impacted on regional and national economies, disrupted supply chains, forced countries to rethink their dependencies on imports of products like PPE or antibiotics. And of course, it's also changed the way we think about the role of the state, the way we think about debt, and the way we think about economic management. And it's impacted, of course, with geopolitical competition. And I was struck by this really fascinating panel that some of you many of you had the chance to listen to, on the economic dimensions of COVID that was earlier this afternoon, and how much of it was a kind of good news, bad news story for New Zealand. People are coming home. That was generally seen as a good thing. But then when we poll them, many of them are actually thinking about leaving again as soon as things get better anywhere else. Exports are up. Hooray! But value is down. Boo! People want what we have to sell them, but we can't get it out of our ports and to get it to market. So, but you know, for all of the success of the New Zealand story, that was, I think, and the New Zealand experiment, the New Zealand model, the elimination model that was talked about so often across so many panels, I was left with some of this talk around COVID a little bit uneasy. And I think Brad Olson put it really nicely in that panel, where he said, we have this really great reputation, what are we going to do with it? And I was struck by something that the Prime Minister said in her remarks early on, where she had that wonderful story about how she almost signed up for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But she said that New Zealanders we're so interested in the rest of the world, we're so engaged, we're so curious, we want to know what's going on out in the world that's out there. And if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said that's absolutely the case. That's absolutely what New Zealanders are like. We're hardwired for that. But today, after 18 months of COVID, when New Zealanders are asked to peek above the parapet and look out at the outside world, I'm not so sure that they feel quite so engaged and enthusiastic about what they see. And there was a survey that DPMC did recently that said that actually half of New Zealanders would probably quite happily leave the borders up, you know, maybe let some Australians and people from the Pacific in, but after that, no thanks. And I do wonder about the social license for this unpacking, this opening up. And as the rest of the world starts to move towards a new normal, I wonder about the threshold of risk that New Zealand is prepared to tolerate. And I particularly wonder, because it's sort of what I'm interested in, and what the diplomatic consequences of this might be. Because, believe it or not, and I think some people might not know this, but plenty of countries' ministers are out travelling around the world, and diplomacy is going on as usual. And I do worry that as the world turns back to a new normal in the Northern Hemisphere, with all the problems that I think Michael Baker very, very ably illustrated, that if we don't get out there and tell our story and talk about our interests, that we might get left behind. And for all the talk about how wonderful Zoom is, for all the talk, and it has its benefits. I think those of us who've been trying to do things like track 2 diplomacy over Zoom over the last year and a half, Zoom is not a way to build relationships, and it's really hard to have frank conversations. So, those are some observations, some remarks. Let me close by saying one of the other themes that I found really fascinating in the panels I went to was the theme of inclusion. I think that it's vital that as we think about this deteriorating strategic environment, the need to work closely with our traditional partners, work closer with our traditional partners, but also find out a way to sustain our economy, to try and think about diversification, to think about the range of new challenges that are emerging, whether in cyber, in space, in the high seas, in the Antarctic, that we need to build a conversation in the country about thinking about those issues, about defence, about foreign affairs, about national security, and to involve as many people as possible in that conversation from so many different communities, young and old. And let me say on that, as a final point, on that last point about youth, how fantastic it is to see so many young people here in the audience today. And I think that I want to say first, especially a shout out, Hutt Valley High School represent. Absolutely wonderful, and I hope that this is the first of many such inclusive conversations, and I congratulate the Institute for a really successful day. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, David, for those closing remarks. I agree with what you said. It's never an easy task to summarise 8 hours of a conference, but that was a fantastic wrap-up. Thank you also to all speakers and panellists. Could we all just give them all another round of applause, please?
While we are doing thank yous, let's also thank all our sponsors and partners without whom this conference would not have been possible. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Centers for Asia Pacific Excellence, which includes the Southeast Asia, North Asia, and Latin America Capes, and the Ministry of Defence, and also our supporting partner, the Asia New Zealand Foundation. Thank you.
We would also like to give a really big thanks to the Executive Director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, Melanie Thornton, and her team for putting today's event together. Getting so many experts, members of the diplomatic community, and academics together for a day is no mean feat. Thank you very much. And one more, of course, thank you to the events team, led by Sandy Isaac, for delivering a slick conference, which is never easy when you're dealing with multiple virtual attendees, but we got there in the end. Thank you very much, Sandy.
And thank you to you for your attendance and very active participation, especially acknowledging the young people in the room. Tim and I have really enjoyed being your MCs today. And it is our great pleasure to invite you to enjoy networking drinks back in the Oceania room. But before we send you off, allow us to leave you with a thought. Ma te rongo ko mohio, ma te mohio ko marama, ma te marama ka mātou, ma te mātou ka ora. Through information comes awareness. Through awareness comes understanding. Through understanding comes knowledge. Through knowledge comes well-being. Our theme today was Standing in the Future. We hope today's conference has helped provide you more information, further enhanced your awareness, understanding, and knowledge to enable you to stand more strongly in the future. Huri noa I te whare, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.